Thank you, Professor Chia Aman Agrawal, for hosting this exciting Indian Institute of Finance International Research Conference and Award Summit in 2023. It's a pleasure and honor to be with you and exchange ideas and my most novel research on the future of resilience finance, ethics of finance diplomacy. And this is pretty much a book that will be coming out with Palgrave Macmillan in 2023. And I, as always, love to exchange ideas with your brilliant network and your really network full with expertise, also from professionals. In this book, I make the case that the post-COVID time might be incited like the previous Renaissance in the 14th century, when a great plague led to a transfer of finance that also imbued in its core this ethical notion of doing something good and prospering not only the social compound, but also the environment. When we think of the Italian Medici, but also the German Fuggers, who thought about how to create with finance lasting values that transcend generations and do good. So have at the core of finance also service, but also explorations and expeditions by the Spanish crown really led to groundbreaking inventions and the transfer of human beings into new territories in the new world in the Renaissance. And today, these Renaissance ideas in our post-COVID world in finance are imbued in the Green New Deal in the US. That's President Joseph Biden's economic project and legacy to ingrain social and environmental concepts into finance. In Europe, we have the European Green Deal and this idea to really measure sustainable finance, what the environmental impact of corporations is. In Asia, since the Copenhagen Accord at the conferences of the Party on Climate Change, we really see a transition into renewable energy that is partially financed by the Western world in the attempt to have economic booming economies like India and China doing this in a sustainable way. And on the global level, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals that really tackle and think about how to use finance, the force of finance, to do good. And I want to speak today a bit about the climate change agenda. And the conferences of the parties recently met and really said we need a redistribution. But now the question is what countries should be paying and refunding other countries for climate change mitigation and adaptation. We can say that climate change is happening when you see here the world surface temperature anomalies since the recording in 1891. There's definitely also since the turn of the millennium a real upwards trend in climate change. But my research really drew a map of we have country differences around the globe and we have different GDP compositions around the globe, and there's a different starting temperature but also top temperature for GDP productivity around the globe. And here in this graph that I drew out of my model, you see the greener the country, the more the country has time ahead in terms of economic productivity until they reach the peak temperature for economic output. And the redder the country, the less the country has time ahead. And in the first notion, I show that there's really this inequality that some countries are gaining a lot from a warming globe, while the most of the rest of the world is really losing. And I already now see that countries that are on the gaining side are also the ones that cause it in CO2 emissions. And we see climate-induced migration and financial inflows in countries that have the most time ahead. So we see this inequality inherent in climate change that we want to tackle with climate justice approaches. And one of the ideas is this ethical notion of redistribution of climate change, or of some of the gains of climate change into areas that are losing out. But how do we determine this? And in my first model, I calculated only the GDP prospects per inhabitant. And as you can see here in this graph, the greener the country, the more the country should be financing red and yellow countries in the transition into renewable energies and climate change mitigation and adaptation. But as you can see here, there's this political infeasibility. And then in order to overcome this political infeasibility, I also factored in some political factors and came up with this model in which I see on the one hand the geo-impact of climate change, then on the other hand, who has good resilience finance means, so what countries have a good starting ground to tackle the climate solution, and which countries are really well connected in terms of their economic and financial output. So in the first models set of indices, I look into the geo-impact of climate change. And in the first index, I see what countries have climate change gains prospect, and what countries are emitting CO2 levels. And here, the redder and the yellow, more yellow or the light green the country is, the more the country should be financing other parts of the world that are in dark green. So you see that China, the US, and Russia in this model should be financing the climate change solution. In the next index, I also factor in climate flexibility. So what countries have a good flexibility in terms of different climate zones. And here you see that Russia also really like the US and China should be financing greener countries. And then I also factor in what countries are changing CO2 emissions. And here you see the role of the US. In 2019, the US drastically lowered its CO2 emissions. And here you see the climate change emissions changes over time, factored in that the US would shift from being a climate funder, so a net funding country, into a country that should receive funds based on the economic incentive that they have lowered their CO2 emissions. In the second set of indices, I really factor in so what countries have a higher responsibility to protect, because they have already in the past established leadership in resilience finance. And in order to determine resilience finance, I first created out of data that comes from Yale University, the metric schmelzing data set has a historical account of financial crisis interventions in terms of guarantees, lending, capital injection, resolutions, rules, asset management, and other factors. And when you factor that into the model, what countries have good financial crisis intervention means, you see that especially China and the US, but also Russia, have the best starting grounds to lead the world in a transition to redistribute climate change gains into losing territories. When you also then only look into financial quantitative easing and guarantees, lending, and capital injection by countries, you see that especially China, again, but also the US and Russia should be funding and leading the world in this redistribution scheme. When you also look into the bank lending rates, then you see that China and the US and Russia, again, are countries that have really good starting grounds, and they have good ways to acquire funds on the international level. So they kind of have this higher responsibility to protect the world from climate change and lead in a transition to renewable energies. And then in the third part of the model, I also look into finance diplomacy, who has the means and the opportunity to lead the world because they have established finance diplomacy means. In the first index in this area, I look into the consumption-based trade adjusted CO2 emissions. So what countries are actually consuming the goods that are produced in other parts of the world and emit CO2. And here you see a small country in Europe, Switzerland, is actually is consuming a lot of CO2 that is emitted by producing goods in other parts of the world. So, but also Nordic European countries there have a higher responsibility to protect the world from climate change in a common climate bonds solution. When you also factor in who has the network in terms of scientific output to lead the world on a common solution against climate change, you see in this created science diplomacy index that's factored into the rest of the model based on academic quota, academic institutions and diplomacy, that the US and Russia should really cooperate in finding a common climate solution. And then finally, when you also think about finance diplomacy in terms of the economic connectivity of a country based on trade, remittances, foreign direct investments and migration, you see small European countries like Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, but also Switzerland, Hungary are supposed to be leading the world in this climate finance solution. And what this all boils down to, and this is pretty much the end of my presentation, I think that we have reached a new finance renaissance. We have the ethics of finance diplomacy ringing in. We have to think about the financial impact also in terms of sustainability. When you think of cryptocurrencies, to this day, there's hardly any information on the sustainability of these means. They are consuming a lot of energy. Can they really produce also something that makes them more sustainable, or makes the finance market really more sustainable, is here the question. We also see future-oriented finance, like cryptocurrencies are heavily used for space exploration, like in the Renaissance when people explored the world. These days we are exploring the world based on cryptocurrency financing. And here also novel ethical questions arise in order to really conquer the space in a more sustainable and ethical way than previous explorations, when you think about the impacts of colonialization. And then finally, finance diplomacy. I would love to see more research on the future of resilience finance in terms of how you can use in order to finance as a tool to be peace tensions. We saw a lot of developments in political divestiture in the green area in the last decade. So now I would love to see also more research into future-oriented finance in terms of finance diplomacy. Decentralized finance in the digital world is an interesting area. So right now we have social media being created that can also create value for its users. We have the first social media tools that are similar to Twitter, but really pay for your interaction. But here again, would love to see ethics. We already have data that in social media, aggressive content is more viral, and there, once you start receiving payment for creating viral content, I would also love to see extensions of ethics in the role of social media in finance, more research on the role of social media for creating finance turmoil is definitely needed, and all of this points into a wave of a new a renaissance with thinking also about human rights online, and where to start and stop free speech for the sake of creating a platform, online platform that is decent, ethical, and sustainable for the future. And with this, I would love to open it up and really also hear from the audience and questions and comments. Thank you very much again for inviting me to give the special address at the International Indian Institute of Finance.